Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we return to the setting of Warhammer 40k with Ciaphas Cain, Defender of the Imperium by Sandy Mitchell. So this is actually the second omnibus to focus on the character of Ciaphas Cain, and I covered the first omnibus a while back, and just on the off chance that you're checking out the review for the second book before reading the first book, I would actually recommend you at the very least, if you don't have time to read the first book or omnibus, at least check out my review or a couple of other reviews on that omnibus, just so you can get, I guess you could say, a more detailed feel for the character. But just to give you an abridged version, Ciaphas Cain is one of those characters who is what you would call an accidental hero in a lot of ways, because he finds himself in these increasingly outlandish and increasingly dangerous situations. And in his position as a Commisar, I mean, he has a lot of authority over, soldiers of the Imperium, but, he often tries to manipulate situations to where, he's in the least amount of danger, but fate oftentimes has a way of, basically taking that intention and putting him in the very, forefront of danger. And some theories abound that, this could be, say, the will of, the Emperor of Mankind himself, to take, someone like Ciaphas Cain and make him to where, even someone who isn't trying to be a hero can ultimately become a hero and become a sort of, figure of hope for humanity. And just to be perfectly frank, hope is something that is in very much short supply in the setting of Warhammer 40k. But Ciaphas Cain starts off as an accidental hero, much like I just described, but somewhere along the way, he actually becomes a hero. And, the way that Sandy Mitchell has the book, or has the books outlined, basically, you're, getting the story straight from the horse's mouth. So, Ciaphas Cain's own words are coming from himself in, say, the first person. And you're seeing a lot of things from his perspective, and sometimes you'll get the side notes of certain characters who try and catch the reader up on events that occurred outside of Cain's knowledge, and so that way you kind of get something close to the full story of what Cain is talking about, as opposed to just his perspective. And it took a bit of getting used to switching from one perspective to another, but eventually, though, Sandy Mitchell, I guess you could say, found a rhythm, to where, the reader, kind of, got used to it. And so, another thing that made Ciaphas Cain's stories stand out in comparison to a lot of other stories from the Warhammer 40k setting is that there's actually a surprising amount of humor in these stories. A lot of it has to do with the fact that, Cain, isn't, say, a space marine or an Astartes. He's just an ordinary human, who's in a position of some level of authority in this, grim setting, but as, just an ordinary human, I mean, he's very relatable in a lot of ways. And in some respects, the very fact that he's not trying to be a hero actually makes him that much more endearing of a character to the reader. And so, it is rather amusing when, he's trying to, get out of, danger from one situation, only to, say, triumph over the danger. And as a result, people start embracing him as a hero. And on the plus side, those who serve under him are far more loyal to him than they would be otherwise, because in this setting, since, commissars are very ruthless in their authority and oftentimes, shoot people for the slightest infractions under their own command, Cain is, one of those guys who wants to keep as many pawns in between him and danger as possible. So, his kindness is oftentimes calculated, but somewhere along the way, it actually becomes genuine, although he tries to brush it off as, oh, I'm just, playing to form, something like that. But as the stories go on, the reader definitely picks up on the fact that, Cain's priorities started to change because, he might on a surface level be trying to, stay true to his nature of, say, putting as much distance in between himself and danger as possible. But at the same time, though, somewhere along the way, he begins to buy into his own legend or his own hype, as it were. And fortunately for a lot of people involved, including himself, this actually plays out rather well in the long run because, on one hand, humanity has a sort of sense of hope whenever he's on the scene. On the other hand, though, whenever Cain's on the scene, even if it's a situation that he doesn't want to be in, he knows that he has people he can count on. And so one of the other things that was, fascinating about the book was that there are certain characters that come up on more than one occasion who, provide familiar faces, along with Cain himself. And unfortunately, this being, a war setting, not all these familiar faces, survive from one book to another. Or, sometimes, they die within pages of being introduced, but they're so well written that they make an impression on the reader, which, highlights, the tragedy of war, that anyone can die, regardless of how likable they are. But for the characters who do manage to stick around, the reader has some familiar faces that they can latch on to, usually. But so the second omnibus, it starts off with a short story called Sector 13, wherein Cain and some of his entourage are given sort of a cushy posting on this sort of pleasure planet, I guess you could say, and it's sort of away from a lot of the hubbub of the war that's constantly going on across the galaxy. But unfortunately, this pleasure planet has kind of been made into a covert base for Genestealers, which in turn means Tyranids. And so, Cain and his people end up having to, contend with a full-on infestation, on what's supposed to be essentially a vacation. And so, you have that, sort of, grim sense of humor in the story, in the sense that, some of the, danger comes from what's supposed to be sources of pleasure, namely, drugs or I should say sex and drugs, but in these dens of iniquity, that's where the very danger comes from. And so, Cain and his people are having to contend with all that. And so that sort of, gets the ball rolling. And then we get into the first full-on novel in the book, and that one is called Death or Glory, in which, Cain's forces are having to go up against this massive orc invasion on this one particular planet. And, it's one of those situations that starts off as, a galactic battle, and then, due to, a crash landing on this one particular planet, they're having to basically, use all their sense of tactics in a fight for survival against an overwhelming force, of which are the orcs in this case. But one of the things that stands out in that particular story is the introduction of a character by the name of Felicia Tiber, who is what is called an engine seer. She is a member of the Mechanicus, or Mechanicum, excuse me, who are basically cyborgs who are made to be engineers and creators for the Imperium. And oftentimes they leave they more or less leave all their humanity behind, you know, and become, I guess you could say, whole new mechanical life forms. But Felicia, though, is just human enough to where, you know, she has a sense of, you know, perkiness and spontaneity that oftentimes irks her, you know, full-on, you know, mechanical superiors. But she and Cain hit it off rather well, and she becomes a rather pleasant face, you know, for, you know, the readers to, you know, be introduced to. But also, you know, there's some rather neat moments wherein, you know, Cain and his forces are having to use improvisation and, you know, sort of on-the-spot tactics against the Orks in ways which, you know, come up as, I guess you could say, you know, very last-minute planning, because, you know, frankly, you know, they didn't go in with the intent of, say, going up against a whole, you know, Ork armada with, you know, as few people as, you know, they initially had with them. But, you know, they end up, you know, getting reinforcements in the form of, you know, civilian refugees and a few military refugees as well that were being held captive, you know, by the Orks. And so they have this sort of, you know, makeshift army that nonetheless is able to acquit themselves rather well. And make no mistake, there's a rather high body count, but once, you know, Cain and his forces, you know, triumph over the Orks, you know, it's a rather, you know, awesome moment of improvisation. And let's just say it involves a massive flood. And, you know, it's something that's still talked about years after it happens. And so that was a pretty good story. And it was a good first novel within this omnibus. And then you have the novel Duty Calls, in which we have the return of a familiar face from the first omnibus, in which we come across Inquisitor Amberley Vail, who... she and Cain are, you know, definitely more than friends, but at the same time, while there's definitely some, I guess you could say, romance between the two that they both try to play around, Vail, you know, because she's an Inquisitor, you know, is free to use Cain for whatever purposes that she wants, and from a military standpoint. And so, you know, she insists on Cain accompanying her on this one particular mission, which ultimately results in Cain and his forces, you know, going up against both forces of the Genestealers and the Tyranids, which I guess you could say are kind of one and the same in this case, as well as a chaos cult. And so, you know, there's a rather you know, fascinating plot thread, you know, that turns up here, in which there's this alien device called the Shadow Light, and it's being held by a rogue Inquisitor who has basically been driven mad, but, you know, he's trying to, you know, form his own schemes, you know, using this device, and he just happens to, you know, incorporate, you know, this newly formed chaos cult, you know, to his own ends, and he basically just kind of manipulates them and plays on their burgeoning insanity. And this device, you know, it basically, you know, amongst other things, you know, gives people telepathic abilities. And so you have, you know, these, you know, frothing madmen who are, you know, full-grown adults, you know, with very dangerous psychic abilities, which, you know, is kind of an indication that, you know, something is off, because usually when psychers, you know, first develop their abilities, it's when, you know, they're young. And so these are people who are, you know, just now becoming psychers. I mean, they were still chaos cultists, but due to being exposed to this device and experimented on, you know, they now have, you know, this massive amount of psychic power, and they're just learning to use it. But it makes them even more dangerous, you know, even more dangerous than they would be if they were just, you know, lunatic chaos cultists. And so, you know, you have you know, Cain and Vail, as well as the returning, you know, character of Jurgen, who is with Cain through all these stories, who is kind of like, you know, his bodyguard, and and his lifelong friend as well. But he's also a blank. Namely, a blank is someone who is able to cancel out telepathic abilities of a psyker. And so, having Jurgen around, definitely comes in handy for this particular mission. And because, being a blank, it nullifies telepathic abilities of both Genestealers as well as psykers. And so, it's definitely a fascinating story in the sense of you're getting threats from multiple angles here. I mean, you have of course you have the Tyranids or genes as well as the Genestealers, and then you have rogue Inquisitors and members of the Mechanicum, and then of course you have Chaos cultists, and you also have a glimpse into alien technology that predates the Imperium, by far, which, comes from a race of aliens called the Old Ones, who were basically behind the creation of, the races of, say, the Orks and the Eldar. But it's just a glimpse, mind you, but it's neat how, this particular story kind of ties it all together. And so, that was a fun story. And then you have Trader's Gambit, which is a short story in which we have kind of the Warhammer 40K equivalent of Die Hard on a spaceship. Namely, Cain and some of the other military personnel are subject to an assassination attempt by Tau loyalists. And so, when I say Tau loyalists, I mean, humans who are loyal to the Tau or the Tau Empire as opposed to the Imperium of Man. And, it's one of those cases where, points could be made for, the Tau being better for humanity than the Imperium of Man, but at the same time, because we're in a setting in which we're seen from the perspective of a human who's, a part of the Imperium, we at least understand Cain's mindset, more than, say, we would a Tau loyalist. But at the same time, though, it's like we kind of find ourselves, wondering what would have happened, had the Tau and humanity been able to, say, mend fences and become allies. But unfortunately, this isn't that kind of setting. And so, like, while there was an interaction, back in the first Omnibus, wherein, Cain kind of made friends with, members of the Tau, it was a very loose form of friendship. And there was, subterfuge, on both sides. But this kind of, comes back in this short story, but at the same time, though, there's no pretense of, friendship. I mean, from anyone here. It's just this particular ship was taken over by Tau loyalists in an area of space which is in dispute, it's taken place in an area of space which is in dispute between the Tau Empire and the Imperium of Man, and unfortunately this ship has been infiltrated by Tau loyalists, and Cain's having to do his best impression of John McClane, and taking out the bad guys. And so it was a fun story. It was a short story, but at the same time, it did offer up a fascinating glimpse into, say, what's going on with humans who are loyal to something other than the Imperium of Man. And it was also fun seeing Cain, like I said, doing his best John McClane impression from Die Hard. And so then we get to the final story, the final novel in this omnibus, Cain's Last Stand. And I think this one is my favorite edition within this omnibus, and I think they definitely saved the best for last, because we fast forward many years later, in which Cain is definitely an older man, and by our standards, I mean, he's probably just straight up old, but because of some of the rejuvenation treatments that certain members of humanity are permitted to have, I mean, he's old but not as withered and haggard as he would be without these treatments. But he's basically secured a cushy position in retirement, and in fact he's actually teaching at a school for commissars. And so people are learning from the great hero, Ciaphas Cain, and he's enjoying his retirement and what have you. But then one day he's brought back, or he's called out of retirement, and basically there's this thing called the Black Crusade that's going on, wherein forces of chaos, from, I guess you could say, the Dark Imperium, or the forces of humanity who have turned traitor and thrown in with the demonic forces of chaos against the Imperium of man. There's this crusade that's called the Black Crusade, and there's something that's kind of on the fringe, in which there's forces of chaos that are focusing on this one particular planet that Cain has actually been to in the past. And in fact, it's the exact same planet where Cain and his makeshift crew fought against a massive orc army, and back in the first novel in this omnibus. And so there's a lot of familiar sights as far as landscape goes, but then it turns out that the reason that all this is going on is because this chaos warlord is wanting to find this technology that had been tied to the old ones, and it's also connected to the aforementioned shadow light artifact, and and it's due to this that we see another familiar element, and that's Engine Seer Felicia Tiber, who is much older now and definitely more machine than human, but she still has her endearing, spunky personality, and she's very happy to see Cain. But Cain and his crew of both regular soldiers as well as aspiring commissars are forced against the forces of chaos, chaos cultists and chaos marines, which are basically the equivalent of Astartes, except corrupted by chaos, and this could be both mentally and physically as well. And so this was probably my favorite story, simply because you're seeing things from the perspective of an older Cain, and that in between the stories that occurred prior to this one and now being this final story in this volume, Cain's seen some shit, and he even refers to some of the stuff offhandedly, but I did like how even, say, a minor element of the Black Crusade ends up being something, terrifying, in the sense that you see how powerful, someone who is corrupted by chaos can be in a position of leadership, namely this, chaos warlord who has, an ability to, telepathically manipulate people, and turn them to his side. And so, it's with this particular trick wherein certain people that we come to know in this novel are unfortunately, turned by his manipulations. And I remember there's a rather, poignant moment wherein Cain and Jurgen, who is still alive, at this time, they come across this army of, chaos cultists, and amongst the members of this army are some of their own soldiers, or some of Kane's own soldiers, and one of them being, an aspiring Commisar that he had trained with, or that had trained under him, I should say. And so Jurgen, being a blank, is able to nullify, the chaotic influence that this guy was under. And so for a brief moment, he returns to his senses and explains to Kain and Jurgen what's going on and who and what this, Chaos Warlord is. But, he's telling him that, or he's telling them that he can feel, the guy's pull even now. Like, this is the first time he was clear-headed since, coming across the guy's path. But even now, he knows that, this respite is only temporary. And so, he ends up committing suicide. But, basically saying it's been an honor serving with you, Commisar. And so, the way that part was written, I mean, it was rather poignant, because, this guy is like, he was given a moment to fight, from within and briefly reassert control of himself. But he knew that it couldn't last. And so, Kain, was, given no alternative but to let the guy kill himself. But, the guy made sure he was able to pass on the information that would help Kain and his forces. And I do like, the final confrontation, between, Kain and, this, Chaos Warlord, because there's, some level of trickery involved. But it's something that's very much within Kain's character. And there's one element in this story that, it's like a deus ex machina, moment, in a sense that, the Necrons turn up, because it turns out that, this, place, because, it's housing, this alien artifact, that was tied to the ancient ones, or I should say the old ones. The Necrons are connected to it, or they're familiar with it, and no one really knows their motivation. But at the same time, though, it's like, the Imperium wants it, the Chaos forces want it, and then the Necrons want it too. And so, and the theory is that the reason the Necrons want it is because, they know what this artifact can do, more so than, the forces of humanity that have been studying it for years, and they're just scratching the surface. And so, they come onto the scene and basically start, wiping out every living organism, that's in between, them and their goal. And they're powerful enough to where, their weapons can literally do that. And so, when Kain sees that the Necrons are on hand, he tells his forces to pull back and, do not get in their way, because he's come across them, more than once throughout his career, especially, going back to, the story, some of the stories in the first Omnibus. And, there was even a memorable, story wherein, there was initially, it was a conflict between the forces of the Imperium and, an army of Orks. But then, when the Necrons came onto the scene, it was kind of like a, three-way battle. And, initially, Kain and his forces, let the Necrons and the Orks, devastate each other before ultimately, beaten it the heck out of there, because it's like they knew that they couldn't stand against both forces, and the Necrons are just on a whole other level, and they didn't have the firepower to take on a whole army of them. And this was just like a small army. And so even though they were outnumbered, just based on their firepower and technology alone, they outclassed, the Imperium by far. And so history was kind of repeating itself, except, now we kind of get a glimpse as to, a sort of motivation of the Necrons from a human perspective, you know, because, you know, Cain and, you know, others, you know, in the story are able to kind of put two and two together that, you know, even if the Necrons didn't create this device, they at least know what it is, and they don't want anyone else getting a hold of it. And so, due to this Necron invasion, you know, the forces of chaos that were led by this warlord are ultimately wiped out. And, you know, then, you know, the artifact is, you know, taken by the Necrons. And so, you know, any sort of, you know, traps that they had that would have, say, destroyed the device are rendered, you know, null and void because the Necrons, you know, got to the device before the traps could be, you know, triggered. And so, you know, it's one of those hollow victories in the sense that, you know, the forces of chaos are wiped out, you know, but it was predominantly, you know, by the Necrons. I mean, make no mistake, you know, Cain and, you know, the forces he was with, I mean, they were able to put up one hell of a fight, but, you know, because of, you know, the telepathic manipulations of, you know, the Chaos Warlord, it's like, you know, they were on a losing streak, you know, or they were on their way to defeat. And it wasn't until, you know, Cain, you know, had his final showdown with the warlord one-on-one, but even then, that wasn't enough to break the hold. And so they had all these, you know, forces that were loyal to the Chaos Warlord, even after the guy had died. But they were, you know, basically outnumbering, you know, the Imperium forces that Cain was with. So it was literally because of this random invasion of the Necrons, you know, that the Imperium can claim some sort of victory. You know, but even then, though, they make sure to note that, say, in the history books, you know, no mention of the Necrons is ever, you know, put in there. And so, all in all, I think I'm going to give this particular omnibus 4 out of 5 stars. I think, you know, in a lot of ways, it was more of the same in the sense that, you know, if you've read the first omnibus, I mean, you kind of have an idea of what's going to happen in the second omnibus in the sense of, you know, Cain being in situations in which, you know, he's thinking that it's going to be a walk in the park, but then it turns out to be something overly, you know, complex and even more dangerous than he ever thought it was. And, you know, him constantly trying to improvise and, you know, find pawns to put in between himself and danger. But on the other hand, though, while there is a lot of more the same, especially in the sense of, you know, the types of, you know, people that Cain comes across or interacts with, as well as, you know, the forces of the Tyranids and the Orks, you know, being very familiar faces, albeit dangerous ones. I do like the fact that in some of the stories here, you're seeing things from a perspective of an older and wiser Cain, and maybe to some extent slightly less cynical than he was in the first omnibus. You see this especially in the final story of Cain's Last Stand, and you know, with him literally being an old man at this point, albeit one that still looks pretty good because of the rejuvenation treatments he's had over the years. So I did appreciate the fact that you're seeing things from the perspective of an older and wiser Cain in some of the stories. But and I also liked seeing some of the familiar faces returning, like especially Jurgen and Amberley Vail. And I did like the introduction of you know, Felicia Tabor. I'm sorry, I keep looking at some of my notes here. It's just, you know, there's a lot of people to keep track of and a lot of plot elements to keep track of. I do think that in some respects, you know, the main plot thread that's involved in a lot of the stories, the Shadow Light, the alien artifact, you know, that, you know, everyone's, you know, trying to go for, you know, I think it was fascinating seeing it from the perspective of people who can only guess at what it was ultimately for. as well as, you know, who built it, or it's like they know who built it, but they don't know who built it. Like, they know that the quote-unquote old ones built it, but they don't know jack shit about the old ones, if you'll pardon my language. But I think it would have been better, and it would have made for a more fascinating read, especially from the perspective of science fiction, if we'd had, say, like, instead of, you know, multiple stories, you know, with a constant plot thread that pops up from time to time, but not being the ultimate focus of, say, these novels. I think it would have been more effective if one of these novels had basically focused just on, you know, Cain and Amberley Vail and others, you know, trying to figure out what this thing is. And, okay, you know, of course, then throw in some, you know, random threat, or maybe not random threat, but, you know, throw in something like a chaos invasion or something like that, which, I mean, they did do, to be fair. But at the same time, though, I just think that if we'd had, like, a whole novel to focus on, you know, learning about the shadow light and what it's for, you know, and as well as, you know, Cain's perspective on the whole thing, I mean, I think that would have been better, as opposed to, say, having, you know, multiple stories in which, you know, this object turns up, but it's not necessarily the whole focus. I mean, there is a focus, but the thing is, it's like you have to read each one of these novels and find the snippets of, you know, story that focus on it in order to get the whole story for that. So I just think that if they'd had one whole novel to focus on, say, that plot element, I think it would have been better. But all in all, though, I mean, still a good read. I don't think it necessarily knocked my socks off this time. Like, it was still good. It was still, you know, if you like Warhammer 40K, and you like the character of Ciaphas Cain, then this is definitely a good read. And I would say that, I mean, I would recommend, obviously, reading, you know, the first omnibus before getting into this one. In fact, you know, slightly funny story here. This was actually, you know, the first time I, you know, got into the character of Ciaphas Cain. Like, I actually started reading this one before reading the first one, because I actually thought this was the first one. But then somewhere along the way, I'm like, there's a lot of stuff in here that makes no sense whatsoever. And it wasn't until years later that I, you know, it's like I put this one on hold. I think I read, like, the first short story and then the first novel in here, and I enjoyed them. But at the same time, I was like, there's a lot of stuff that they talked about that I had no idea what was going on. And so it wasn't, I put this one on hold indefinitely. And then years later, I finally found the first omnibus at this, you know, Warhammer store over at Firewheel Mall. And so I was like, okay, that's the first one. This is the second one. So I read the first one. And then after, you know, getting back into rereading this one, after all this time, it's like, okay, things make way more sense now. So definitely read the first omnibus before reading this, this one. So just to be clear. But, so yeah, if you like Ciaphas Cain, and you like the, I guess you could say, humorous aspects that, you know, come into play whenever he's on hand. I mean, not to say it like the stories are full of comedy, but there's more comedy in his stories than you'd probably get in, you know, your run-of-the-mill, you know, Warhammer, you know, Space Marine or Imperial Guard story. And so if you like that approach, then this is definitely a good continuation of his character's storyline, and just, you know, that sense of direction as well. But on the other hand, though, you know, with the exception of the very last story in here, there wasn't anything that I would call great. That's not to say that the other stories weren't good, but it's kind of been there, done that. But sometimes been there, done that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just, you know, it's something you're familiar with, and you know that you can get a sense of enjoyment from it. But but there's a part of you that's kind of like, okay, I'm gonna have a good time, but, you know, I'm not gonna be blown away. You know, but it's not really until the last, excuse me, it's not until the last story, you know, that we're blown away, so to speak. So hence why I'm giving it the 4 stars out of 5. But yeah, that was my take on you know, Ciaphas Cain, Defender of the Imperium, the second Omnibus, as written by Sandy Mitchell. And I hope y'all enjoyed the review. And if you got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care. Bye.